courts should try not to make major changes to the rules of elections close to the day itself, but there are still so many cases pending. You're really seeing a record number of cases, and it does lead to a lot of confusion. For example, in South Carolina, there have been so many back and forth rulings and injunctions and stays on whether a witness signature is required, which is also a problem in the primary in Wisconsin. So you could have situations where people see the news that a court ruled that a signature isn't required, so they don't get it for their ballot, but then that decision gets stayed and their vote might be cast into doubt.
More of my conversation with Grace Panetta in just a moment. Stick with us.
The Takeaway is supported by Atlassian. Fortune 500 companies use collaboration software like Jira and Trello from Atlassian, enabling teams to keep aligned to key goals and connected to one another. That's how businesses the size of small countries stay agile. Learn more at Atlassian.com.
It's Politics with Amy Walter on The Takeaway. We're back with more of my conversation with Business Insider's Grace Panetta. We were talking about how lawsuits taking place this close to the election confuse not only voters, but also election officials who find themselves having to explain rules they're waiting for clarification on.
In Wisconsin, we're seeing this over when ballots can be received by and over the voter registration deadline. And it really, can cause a lot of strain for election officials to have to communicate the rules out to people and make sure they get counted. And as for when we can expect these suits to be resolved, it really, really depends on the situation. But hopefully officials just really want clarity around the rules so they can properly educate voters. And then when it comes to the post-election side of things, absolutely, we can see, immediately lawsuits to be filed over the counting of mail ballots and the rules around that in such an unprecedented situation. No side is going to want to give up an inch.
What's your sense about whether one side or the other is better prepared, Democrat, Republican, Biden, Trump, for this?
Yeah, so both campaigns just have massive litigation teams that are focused 100% on these issues all the time now. It's really a mammoth effort. And the Democrats have won a lot of victories in the swing states, notably with extending the deadlines by which ballots must be received by. We've seen judges in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and then in North Carolina, the state elections board settled to extend the deadline by which ballots must be received, which is a big win for Democrats because late arrival of ballots is a top reason why ballots are disqualified. The other thing, too, and the Washington Post did a really great analysis about this recently, is that in many of the cases that have been fought in federal court, really no judges have sided with Trump's view that voter fraud is extremely pervasive and rampant, or that voter fraud with mail ballots is rampant. There hasn't been any cases where a judge has, sided with that and agreed that that's what the evidence shows. And so Trump, by making the statements that he's made, has sort of put himself in a bit of a tough position because there's a big gulf between what he says and what his campaign can prove in court. And the Republicans have won, some victories, especially around, third-party ballot collection, other cases around when ballots can be received and what conditions ballots have to follow to be accepted. So like in Pennsylvania, a really big one was this issue of ballots that lack a secrecy envelope, which is another really niche, arcane thing that's all of a sudden
right.
used.
Right. Everybody knows what a naked ballot is, which sounds kind of dirty, actually.
I know.
But
we need a better term for it. But yeah, I would say, looking at particularly the swing states, the Democrats have succeeded in getting a lot of these really, really big changes that they were asking for, whereas Republicans have been kind of unable to substantiate the president's assertions of widespread fraud.
Well, help us understand this, too, because let's say now it's a couple days after the election, one candidate wins a state by a pretty big margin. OK, let's say it's 3, 4, 5 points. Would a legal action automatically be thrown out if the losing side brought it up? Is there sort of a cutoff by which a judge would say, look, or the state law would say, look, this has to be within a certain number of votes or a certain percentage of votes?
Most states allow a losing campaign, to petition for a recount. There are some that require the vote margin to be within a certain percentage In terms of, challenging the validity of ballots in certain areas, there's something experts refer to as the margin of litigation, at which point it's advantageous or not to be filing such challenges because, these court cases are expensive financially. They take up time. They, are just a big undertaking for a campaign.
Grace Panetta is a politics reporter covering elections and voting for Business Insider. As most of you already know, Pennsylvania is a critical battleground state in this election. In 2016, President Trump won the state and its 20 electoral votes by less than 1%. But it's also a state that political insiders worry could experience massive challenges administering this election.
Basically, every element of voting is different from 2016.
That's
Jonathan Lai, and I'm a voting rights reporter with the Philadelphia Inquirer.
I started by asking Jonathan to walk me through the changes to voting in Pennsylvania and what that could mean for voters and election officials.
When it comes to in-person voting, every single voting machine across the entire state has been replaced. And when it comes to voting by mail, Pennsylvania last year enacted a new law that now allows any Pennsylvania voter to vote by mail without requiring an excuse. That plus the pandemic has really shifted the attention onto voting by mail. About half of the voters in the presidential primary in June voted by mail, and maybe close to half or even half of voters this year will be voting by mail. And that's really significant because in the past, only about 5% of the votes were by mail.
And in the primary, can you walk us through some of the challenges or some of the good things that happened? Basically, help us understand if what you saw in the primary gives us any insight into what we could expect for November.
Yeah, I think basically we take all the challenges that we saw in the primary when it comes to staffing, when it comes to being able to handle an absolute surge in mail ballot requests, when it comes to being able to open polling places and safely social distance people. We take all those challenges from the primary and we basically double them, right? Because turnout's going to be about double. And so everything that was difficult, including counting the ballots afterward, all of that is just so much higher now.
And it took a long time, especially in Philadelphia and the Philadelphia suburbs, to get those ballots counted. But were there also problems with that? I know a lot of ballots have been deemed invalid. Can you walk through some of that?
Yeah, the reality is voting by mail does have higher rejection rates than voting in person. That's just part of voting by mail across the country. That's because usually things like people miss the deadlines, people have problems with their signatures, or now what we're seeing in Pennsylvania is if you forget to use your inner secrecy envelope and you return what we're calling a naked ballot, those will be rejected as well. It also takes a long time to count these ballots. The reality is counting a paper ballot that is cast by mail takes longer than counting, just tallying up electronically all the votes that were cast on voting machines on election day.
Plus, Pennsylvania law is that you can't start tabulating or even processing these ballots. Is that right? Before election day?
That's right. In Pennsylvania, you can't do anything with the mail ballots until 7 a.m. on election day. That's when polls open. That's when you're allowed to start checking the envelopes, comparing signatures, opening the envelopes, taking out the ballot. You can even start scanning them. You just can't release the numbers or anything like that.
I'm going to go to the quote that has now become sort of infamous the president made at the debate the other night where he said bad things happen in Philadelphia. And he specifically focused on the issue of poll watchers and a poll watcher for the Republicans being kicked out of an early vote precinct in the city of Philadelphia. Can you help us understand what's going on there and whether this was actually done illegally or not?
As far as we can tell, the president is wrong. It does not appear like these under law count as polling places. So here's what's happening. You're allowed to go to your county elections office and apply for a mail-in ballot in person. You're also allowed to request that ballot be given to you on the spot. You're allowed to fill it out, and you're allowed to return it. You can do that in one visit. And so what's happened is that's being described as early voting. It's not technically a polling place, early voting center the way other states do it. You're not using a voting machine. You're requesting and filling out and submitting a mail ballot in one visit at the election office. So that's what these are. Philadelphia is opening 17 of these elections offices where people can go. They can also register to vote there. It's very much an election office. However, because people are voting there, these supposed poll watchers, which I should note, we don't really know that they are poll watchers because in Pennsylvania, you have to be certified as a poll watcher. We can't have random people arbitrarily entering polling places. So there are reasons why you have to be certified as a poll watcher. The Trump campaign does not have certified poll watchers in Philadelphia right now. And so these were not poll watchers. And as far as we can tell, under state law, these are not polling places.
Talk to us about the other issue. This is not Philadelphia itself, but Northeast Pennsylvania, where there was the case of ballots being tossed out. President Trump again addressed this, saying these ballots, they were thrown in the trash. They had my name on them. Just another sign that Democrats are trying to rig this election. Can you tell us what that's really about? What happened there?
This is in Luzerne County, which is a Republican-led county that is actually a swing county that voted for Obama and then voted for Donald Trump in 2016. This is not what the president is describing. There's no evidence of fraud or a conspiracy to rig the election. The county has said that there was a temporary worker who, in this worker's first few days on the job, got confused about the envelopes and the ballots, thought that perhaps it was not a ballot, but it was an application, got confused, and threw the ballots out. To be clear, it is not good that election materials, including ballots, be thrown out, even if by mistake. That is not the same thing as having some sort of grand conspiracy to rig an election. There were 9 ballots, and I will note, former DOJ officials and experts say we should not know whom those ballots were cast for. We should not know that 7 of those votes were cast for Donald Trump. There is no legitimate investigative reason for us to know that. Instead, they say that that suggests partisan reasons.
Jonathan, I really appreciate you taking all this time with us today to walk through all of this. Thank you for all the great reporting you're doing up there, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Jonathan Lai is a voting rights reporter with the Philadelphia Inquirer.
The Takeaway is supported by LifeLock, reminding consumers that millions of Americans have been affected by identity theft. Learn more at lifelock.com.
We want you to be part of the Takeaway's Listener Response Network. We'll send you a few text messages a week about topics we're discussing on our show. To sign up, just text the word START to 69866. Standard data and messaging rates apply, and you can always text the word STOP to opt out. Again, text START to 69866 to join our conversation every day. You can also connect with us on Facebook, Twitter. We're at The Takeaway.
Support for KQED comes from Strauss Family Creamery, featuring organic milk in reusable glass bottles, minimally processed to maintain flavor, nutritional benefits, and culinary performance, and never ultra-pasteurized to increase shelf life. Available at stores throughout the Bay Area. Sutter Health, dedicated to making healthcare accessible during these challenging times. From same-day appointments to virtual visits, the Sutter Health Network strives to provide patients whatever treatment they need today and every day. More at sutterhealth.org.
October the 15th is the deadline for a Brexit deal. Yes, another Brexit deal. But just because there's a deadline doesn't mean there's going to be a deal.
We just survived one extinction event, and now we have this big challenge of possibly having huge costs.
I'm Kai Rizdal. Coronavirus to Brexit, how British businesses are doing next time on Marketplace.
It's coming up at 4 o'clock.
It's Politics with Amy Walter on The Takeaway. Investigative journalists, the Manhattan District Attorney, 2 out of 3 Americans, according to a Reuters Ipsos poll. What do they all have in common? Well, they want to see Donald Trump's taxes. People have spent years requesting, searching, and otherwise trying to force those documents to light with the same fervor that propelled King Arthur, at least some of them. And by now, you've certainly heard some of the big takeaways. Andrea Bernstein is co-host of the Trump Inc. podcast from WNYC and ProPublica. She's also author of American Oligarchs, The Kushners, the Trumps, and the Marriage of Money and Power. That's out in paperback on Tuesday.
So the thing that really stood out the most to me was what the New York Times described as the vise that Trump is under. He owes hundreds of millions of dollars of debt, which we understood, but we didn't understand the backdrop that he is really hemorrhaging money from his businesses. So here you have a president who has a almost direct financial interest in winning re-election. So it's not just about holding on to power or prestige, as it is for most presidents running for re-election, or being able to enact a certain ideological program. In his case, his family company's bottom line directly depends on the outcome. And that's because if he's president in the next few years when this debt is due, it puts the banks in this really difficult situation of having to decide, perhaps, are they going to default a sitting president, or are they going to not? Either choice is bad, and so long as he's president, he has the ability to drum up profits in his hotels and his golf courses by what we see every day, which is that people who seek favor from him can patronize his establishments and will typically get something from it, or will often get something from it. So he has this sort of money machine possibility while he's president, but not so much if he loses. And that is a really unique historical situation that we're in.
But it seems as if, and the New York Times pointed this out too, that even with all the benefits, as you pointed out, of being president and having all these properties and potentially using them to help pump up his profits, they've still continued to lose money. So if this indeed is a gambit to try to make as much money as possible to shore these holdings up, it hasn't really worked out, has it?
Well, it has and it hasn't. It's certainly clear from the Times reporting and from reporting that we've done that he's been able to make more money than he would have. That is, lose less money because he's president. So there's that. And the other thing that if you look at sort of the broad historical sweep that this reporting and other reporting brings out, what you see is a man who has always been able to start with a big pile of money and then find some other infusion. So first it was his father's real estate empire that he was able to use to invest in businesses and enterprises that were mostly losing money. The Apprentice gave him a big infusion of money and all the licensing deals that came off of that. And he spent it on golf courses, which it's been clear for quite some time are money-losing businesses. And now he's in a situation where his sort of next mechanism for propping up his empire is the presidency. That is extraordinary.
Andrea, these stories, as you know and you've reported on, have been out here for a while. There's new reporting here in the New York Times because they have access to his tax records. But it seems like these stories come out, they make this big splash, and then there's this sort of collective shrug, it seems, from the American public. Either we knew this about him and this is why we don't like him, or this, I like him, I don't think this is true, or he's just a good businessman and he's writing off losses like any good business would. He's still a really rich dude. I don't understand it. So is there a reason you think that these don't get the kind of traction that, again, in any other era with any other person as president would seem to be a big, big campaign-altering deal?
Yeah, well, these stories exist in the same truth ecosystem that every other story exists in. So we have the Trump base, the sort of roughly 40% of the American public who believe and have been encouraged to believe by him and by supportive news sources that every time a story like this comes out, it's just to tarnish Trump. And one of the things I like about Trump is that he stands up to what they see as attempts to tear him down. That's one of the things that appeal to them. So it's this sort of perfect cycle of a story comes out which would fell anybody else, but for Trump it somehow solidifies the support among his base. The question is, does it mean anything to anyone, to that tiny sliver of swing voters, to this sort of corporate permission structure, which was very happy in the early days of Trump to go along because people were making money, their taxes were getting lowered. But you see a situation where his own financial enterprise looks shakier and shakier and shakier. It can raise questions. So I think that there is certainly that. There's certainly the idea that while people are really suffering in this country, the president is paying so little taxes. And this is from a man whose family company was started with help from the taxpayers. There never would have been a Trump real estate empire had not U.S. taxpayers guaranteed loans in the early days and really helped get it off the ground. So that is the irony here, that the Trump company, the Trump organization and all its affiliated companies succeeded because of we the taxpayers. And Donald Trump's father, Fred Trump, and now Donald Trump, and one of the things that the Times pointed to, also his children, appear to be doing everything they can to not pay anything back to the well of taxpayers that sort of made them what they are. And the idea at the time was that this is good for everybody. It's good for the private developers and the private business people, but also good for the country to have these people succeed. So there was a sense of everybody marching together in the same direction that has really, really frayed, and particularly under this president. And, it's something that is the sort of both the general direction that the country's been moving in to have very wealthy people pay fewer and fewer taxes, but it's something that the Trump family has almost stands alone in the way that they have avoided paying taxes. And this is something that the Times documented. And one year it was sort of Trump who claimed the biggest losses and the biggest deductions. So it's an actual, not just a figurative superlative.
Andrea Bernstein, thank you so much for joining me, walking us through this.
Thank you so much, Amy. Great talking to you as always.
Andrea Bernstein is co-host of the Trump Inc. podcast from WNYC and ProPublica. She's also the author of American Oligarchs, The Kushners, the Trumps, and the Marriage of Money and Power. And that's all for us today. I think we can all agree it's time for everyone to take a deep breath as we process a lot of news happening very fast. We'll be watching it with you. And let's give some props to the team who helped make this happen. Our senior producer, Amber Hall, Patricia Yacob, who's our associate producer, Polly Orungu, our digital editor, David Gable is our executive assistant, Jay Cowett is our director and sound designer, Debbie Daughtry is our board op, Vince Fairchild is our board op and engineer, our executive producer is Lee Hill. Of course, you can call us anytime at 877-8MY-TAKE or send us a tweet. I'm at Amy E. Walter. The show is At The Takeaway. Tanzina Vega is back with you on Monday. Thanks so much for listening. It's Politics with Amy Walter on The Takeaway.